Hello everyone, Panzer J back with a new video, and this is another video in my historical board gaming Global War 1939 strategy video. I'm tackling each nation. This video is going to be on China, and that covers both national and communist China. And the nationalist Chinese are these green units, and the communist Chinese are up here to the north, these purplish units. Now, at the beginning of the game, they, both national and communist China, is at war with Japan, which are these yellow territories here bordering China. So they are part of the Allies, and they are at war with Japan right at the start of the game. So you can expect some serious Japanese attacks right on turn one. Japan goes second in each round, whereas the communist Chinese go third, I believe, and national China is sixth. So you're going to get attacked from the Japanese right at the start of the game, right on turn one. So as far as units that the Chinese start the game with, for the communist Chinese, we'll take a look at them up here in the north. They only have 2 territories, and they have a total of 5 infantry and 1 artillery. The nationalist Chinese have many more territories, and they start out with a bunch of infantry spread out here in Sichuan, which is their capital. They have 6 infantry. They also have a couple of AA guns, one here in Sichuan and one here on the coast in Kwangtung. They have an air base in Sichuan, and they also have 1 fighter, and that fighter represents the Flying Tigers, which was an American unit that volunteered to fight with the Chinese. So those are the units they start the game with. So not a lot of offensive power. They're much more of a defensive force. And that's really how you have to play both the national and the communist Chinese. You don't have access to tanks, any aircraft at all, other than the 1 fighter that national China has, the Flying Tiger. Other than that, you're not going to really be able to purchase any units that have offensive power. Now, the national Chinese can purchase artillery, which we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But other than that, you're mostly going to just get infantry. So infantry only attacks at a 2, defends at a 4. So you're in much better shape if you're defending as the Chinese. So for the first few turns, maybe even as late as 5, 6 turns into the game, you're mostly just going to be trying to hold on. Maybe you want to trade some space for time. So maybe you want to kind of pull back from some of these territories that border with Japan. You want to concentrate as many infantry units you can in maybe a couple of different territories, leave the rest of them empty, or maybe leave a single infantry in each territory with a couple of territories with stacks of men, and just basically you're kind of awaiting the Japanese attack. Same thing with the communist Chinese. They have even less units to work with, but again, other than the artillery piece they start with, they only have access to infantry. So the communist Chinese really is pretty much confined to defensive strategies. Now, in the last game, I was the Chinese, both national and communist Chinese, and I did actually, towards the end of the game, have the Chinese on the offensive. I was into several of these Japanese territories, but that was only after about 4 or 5 turns worth of staying on the defensive. So what you've got to kind of hope for is the Chinese is that Japan doesn't go absolutely 100% full out to attack you at the beginning of the game. If Japan goes ahead and commits pretty much all their resources, both militarily and economically, to come after you, there's probably not a whole lot you're going to do to stop them, and you probably aren't going to stick around the game for very long. If Japan makes you their number one priority, then you're probably going to fall as the Chinese. By the time the U.S. gets into the conflict, or the other allies in the Pacific can start like kind of counterattacking Japan, you're going to either be completely wiped out, or you're probably going to be backed up into these last couple of territories that are bordering with Russia over here. So the first thing is it's not, obviously it's out of your control what the Japanese player is going to do. So your chances of survival are pretty much dependent on the Japanese strategy. If they go after you full on right from turn one, probably not a whole heck of a lot you can do. If they don't make you the priority, or they kind of spread themselves thin going after, maybe the Far East Command down here, going after the Money Islands in the South Pacific, maybe engaging in some conflict with Australia, then obviously Japan's dispersing their units, and you've got a much greater chance of being able to hang on. And what I did last time was the Japanese player kind of went in every different direction, trying to take a little bit of everything at the same time. So his attacks into China weren't as heavy as they possibly could have been. So that allowed me to kind of weather the opening blows. I lost territory bordering with Japan, but then as his offensive started to peter out a little bit and he was devoting resources to other areas of the Pacific, I was then able to start taking territories back. And again, you have mostly just infantry, but I had access to a decent amount of infantry. So I was able to slowly start taking territories back as both communist and national China. As a matter of fact, this communist China had a couple of these northern Manchurian territories. And for national China, I was right at the doorstep of Shanghai here, right on the coast. So at that point, because of what was happening both in the Pacific and Europe, the Axis player surrendered. But if he hadn't, I was on the verge of kicking Japan completely off of the Asian mainland there. So again, as any of the Allies players, you're very much reactionary to what the Axis player does. They have the advantage, especially at the beginning of the game. They definitely have a military advantage over you. So you kind of just got to see in what direction the Axis player is going to take his units and then react from there. So hopefully he's not making you the top priority. So what you're going to do is, again, probably trade territories, trade space for time. You don't want to leave any territory completely empty. You don't want the Japanese to just walk in there, even if you just leave a single guy in some of these territories that are bordering with Japan and kind of pull back a little bit. I like to build up. You definitely don't want to lose Sichuan here. I like to build up a couple of territories worth of units. So maybe you've got a stack of 6 or 8 guys in a couple of different territories. And that way, you got a couple of good counterattack forces once the Japanese player starts to spread himself a little bit thin. Other than that, like I said, what you're hoping is that you hold on long enough for the Allies in the Pacific to start exerting pressure on Japan so that they have to divert themselves from full-on attacking you and deal with maybe some threats that the Far East Command or Australia is presenting. The U.S. obviously is also going to be a big ally for you, but they might not get in the game until 5, 6, 7 turns. So you're going to have to hold on for quite a while before you can rely on the United States. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't even necessarily rely on the United States in terms of what your strategy is going to be at the beginning of the game, because they're not going to be around for a little bit. So hopefully the Far East Command down here in India, and then the Anzac, the Australians, are exerting enough pressure so that they're pulling the Japanese away from you. As far as some of the special rules for the national Chinese, you have the decentralized military. So what that means is China can place purchase units in any original Chinese territory that they've held since the beginning of the turn. The only restriction is there's a maximum of 6 that you can place per territory. So unlike other countries in the game where they have to place newly purchased units in territories that hold an industrial complex, as you can see, China doesn't have any industrial complexes, neither does communist Chinese. So they can place any newly purchased units in any of these territories they want, as long as they held that territory at the beginning of the turn and that they're restricted to only placing 6 new units. So that's one good thing for you, is you can kind of, if you're collecting, if you purchased, 4 or 5 infantry that turn, you can drop a bunch of them down all over in any of these territories that you want to use as blockers for the next Japanese attack. So that's a nice little advantage for China. As far as the not placing more than 6 in a territory, you're probably not going to run into that problem. China doesn't get a lot of money. There's not much chance for them to earn money. So even infantry, the cheapest unit in the game is $3 a piece. So 6 infantry, that's $18. So the chances that you're collecting more than $18 to possibly have purchased, more than 6 units in a turn probably isn't that great. So you're probably not going to really run into that issue too much as far as only being able to place 6 units per territory. But just in case you've somehow got China as an offensive and economic juggernaut, just be mindful of that rule for China. We also already talked about the Flying Tiger, so that's the American fighter plane. That attacks and defends at +1. So fighters usually or normally attack and defend at a 6 on a 12-sided die roll, so that's going to be a 7 for attack and defense for the American plane. The thing with that, though, is if you lose it in combat, that's it. You don't get to purchase another one. So you want to hold on to that. That's very important. That's really about, it's definitely your best offensive unit that you have in the game. So you want to protect it as much as you can. Usually what I like to do is I probably wouldn't even use it for the first turn or two. I keep it here in Szechuan away from Japanese units. And then as the Japanese start to push in a little bit on me, I'll use the plane. I'll fly it out a couple of spaces and use infantry as well that are connected to that territory and do an attack on a Japanese force that's moved in a little bit on China, and then I'll move it back to Szechuan. But I always want it sitting back here in Szechuan as far away from Japanese units as I can. You do not want to lose the Flying Tigers. Also, as you can see here, this line right here that starts in Calcutta and winds its way up through and ends in Szechuan, that's the Burma Road. So you don't want to lose. The only territory you have that has the Burma Road in it is Szechuan itself. And then the Burma Road runs through these 3 Far East Command territories, Calcutta, Bangladesh, and Burma. So you do not want the Burma Road to be cut, because as long as the Burma Road is open, China can purchase, national China, not communist China, national China can purchase artillery. So if the Japanese were to come in through here and take Burma, any one of these territories that contains the Burma Road, the Japanese take that territory, the Burma Road's now closed. So now you do not have access to purchasing artillery. So the last game, I didn't really purchase much in the way of artillery. I mostly did infantry. Infantry and artillery both defend at a 4. The advantage to the artillery is they attack at a 3 instead of a 2 for the infantry, and they can pair with infantry on a one-on-one basis to increase the attack of the infantry to a 3. But again, especially at the beginning of the game, you're going to pretty much exclusively be on the defensive. So I was just basically purchasing all infantry to to give myself as many units as I possibly could put on the board at a good defensive value. I mean, maybe later in the game, if the tide is kind of turning against Japan, and you're thinking about going on the offensive a little bit more, then artillery would probably make sense at that point. But you can only purchase the artillery as long as the Burma Road is open, and you can purchase any amount of artillery you want. So if you have $15, I believe artillery is $4 a piece. You could purchase 3 artillery, and those could be placed down in any national Chinese territory, the same as the infantry that you purchase can be. You start the game as China, national China, with $12. And that represents the $12 worth of territory you have. So as you can see, with only collecting $12 a turn, and that's just at the turn 1, you don't have a lot of money. So you're better off just simply purchasing infantry for the defensive value there. I think in the last game I had China up to around $16, $18 maybe. So even that's not a lot. And that was with, again, being on the offensive and having some of these original Japanese territories. So like I said, you're never going to really be in a position where you're going to collect any kind of serious money. You start out with the $12, but you're going to lose several of those territories. You can probably count on losing these 3 territories that border Manchuria right here on turn 1. That's usually a typical Japanese play. But you've collected the $12 to start the game with. So you're going to, even if they take several territories from you, you're going to have $12 to spend on turn 1. Now, as the national Chinese, you start at the game at the war with Japan, and you can liberate or capture any Japanese held territory. So again, all of these original Japanese territories here in yellow, you can go into those and you would collect the income for those. National China can also capture original Chinese territories instead of liberating them. So you're not at war with communist China, but let's say Japan comes up here, takes this communist Chinese territory. You could then counterattack the Japanese, take that territory back, and you would take that yourself as opposed to it reverting back to communist Chinese control. So you may not move units into any territory originally owned by the Far East Command except for Hong Kong. So you can't come down here like with these units bordering Burma, let's say, to like beef up Burma's defense. You cannot move into Far East Command territories except for Hong Kong over here. So another play early in the game usually is the Japanese player is to take Hong Kong. So if you were in a position to as national China, you could then counterattack and go into Hong Kong. You can move units down here, though, into French Indochina and Saigon. Those are 2 territories that non-original Chinese territories that you can move into. So that allows you to come down here. French Indochina is worth $1, Saigon's worth $3. So if you could make your way all the way down to Saigon, that would definitely be a nice little boost for you economically. And I think that's really about it for national China. As far as communist China goes, they start the game at war with Japan. They build and move units at the same time as Russia. Now, communist China may attack at the same time as Russia as long as both powers are at war with the Axis power to be attacked. So, for instance, if both Russia and communist China are at war with Japan, then you can move the communist Chinese units at the same time as the Russian units. You cannot attack national China, but you automatically take over a national Chinese territory when either a Russian or communist Chinese land unit moves into an empty nationalist Chinese territory. So again, it's the same kind of theory as when national China takes over a communist Chinese territory. If some of these vacated Chinese territories from a Japanese attack, you could come down as the communist Chinese and take those. Now, as far as builds, Communist China is limited to placing only 1 infantry per turn. So basically, regardless, they don't operate off. Their territories are worth $3. The two territories combined are worth $3, but their unit purchases are not based on income. It's just simply, regardless. As the Communist Chinese, you could, let's say, take 3 or 4 of these Japanese territories, have your own territories worth, say, $8 or $9 total, which is actually where I was at as the Communist Chinese last game. And you still only simply get 1 infantry per turn. So it's not even like you're spending money to purchase it. You just automatically get 1 infantry, and you place that down in one of the 2 original Communist Chinese territories. Other than that basically covers the Chinese. Again, I would recommend a defensive strategy at the beginning of the game. You're going to find yourself, even if the Japanese don't come after you 100% full-on offensive power, you're still going to find yourself on the defensive to start. Your purchases probably want to lean towards infantry. You might want to purchase a few artillery while the Burma Road is still open. I've seen the Burma Road gets cut, I don't know, in my experience, about 50% of the time. It's easier for the Japanese player to at least get to Burma here, and that would cut your Burma Road. So maybe you'd want to take advantage of the road being open the first few turns of the game and purchase artillery. I would recommend just infantry because, again, you're going to be on the defensive so much. Maybe a little bit later in the game, if the tide is kind of turned, then you can think about purchasing artillery to go on the offensive a little bit. But overall, as both national and communist China, you want to have a defensive strategy, pull back a little bit, leave 1 infantry in each territory so the Japanese just can't come in and walk into an empty territory, and hopefully a little bit later kind of string out the Japanese units, make them expend their offensive power a little bit, and then take it to them maybe by around turn 5 or 6. So good luck. Hopefully, as the Chinese, you hold on long enough for your allies to come to your aid. We'll be tackling Anzac in the next video, and we'll see you next time.